6th.
We'll give it a few more seconds so that it continue to populate, then we'll start up and then let the other folks in. Hi, Rodney. Somebody say, Rada, how are you? Okay, it's about 6:35. And I think we want to go ahead and start. We want to honor the time of people who are here at this point. As per usual, we assume that people will continue to join as we go through. When they come in, they will be welcome and they'll be able to join us in progress. Thanks to all who have once again chosen to be with us. We're really happy that you're joining us for this very, very special presentation tonight. In the midst of all that's happening, you did choose to be with us, and we're very appreciative that you made that move. We are actually going to move right into the program because there really is a great deal that we want to hear from our guest. We don't want to tax her, but she has so much that she has to offer, and we want to make sure that that time is fully invested properly and appropriately. Before we begin, I'd like to make a couple of announcements. I guess I should tell you who I am. My name is Joseph Jordan. I've been here at the university for about 21 years now and served for most of that time as director of the Stone Center and teaching in African and African-American and diaspora studies. And I'm currently serving as vice provost for academic and community engagement. Like any good son of the Caribbean, I have 5 or 6 different jobs doing what needs to be done. I also want to make a couple of announcements to the community that's listening in. Some of you may have intended to be a part of the MLK Week activities that were sponsored by Diversity and Inclusion. And as you know, those events were rescheduled. So I just want to make it known that the MLK University Community Banquet, which is still going to be held virtually, is going to be held on Sunday, February 20th at 6 p.m. And this is the event that will feature Dr. Elmira Mangum. Many of you may have remembered her when Dr. Mangum was here at the university in upper administration. When she left to become the first woman president of Florida A&M University. I know that she's a dynamic speaker. We've had her before for events. So I know they would love to have you be a part of that. And that will be followed by the MLK Lecture and Awards ceremony that will be held on Tuesday, February 22nd at 6:30 p.m. In the Carolina Union Great Hall. And the speaker for that event will be Latasha Brown, who is co-founder of the Black Voters Matter Fund and the Black Voters Matter Capacity Building Institute. You'll be able to get tickets for both of those. I would suggest that you go to diversity.unc.edu. On that page, they have a full list of activities. that will be happening during February, as well as information about attending those events. Tonight, we have, I guess, one of the most important elements of Black History Month here on UNC's campus, and that is representation from the history department. And I think it's important to say that part of the reason that this event continues and continued for so long is because of the leadership that the history department took in making sure that this event happened. Tonight, we have Dr. Lisa Lindsay, who is professor and chair of the Department of History, who's going to do the welcome. And after that, we're going to move right into Dr. Carla Slocum, who is Associate Dean at the College of Arts and Sciences, who will do the introduction of our speaker for this evening. Lisa, thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction. On behalf of the campus community at UNC Chapel Hill, I'm pleased and honored to welcome our viewers and listeners to this 36th annual African American History Month lecture, and to welcome Dr. Chatelain, at least virtually, to UNC. I also bring you greetings from Chancellor Kevin Guskowitz, who's traveling this evening as part of the university's fundraising campaign and unfortunately could not be here. My name is Lisa Lindsay. I'm a professor in the history department and serve as its chair. And I am very pleased to reaffirm the history department's commitment to the African American History Month lecture, as did my predecessors, Professors Fitz Brundage and Lloyd Kramer, and to honor the legacy of history professor emeritus Jenna Ray McNeil, who worked tirelessly to institutionalize this lecture here at the university. I'd also like to thank all the sponsors, including the Office of the Chancellor and the Stone Center for Research in Black Cultures and Histories, and especially Professor Joseph Jordan, Vice Provost for Academic and Community Engagement, and wearer of many hats, as you just heard. This year's lecture comes during a period that has seen tremendous upheaval in many institutions brought on by the pandemic and other challenges. We here at UNC have been confronted with difficult challenges that tested our community, even as students, faculty, staff, and many alumni across the country have continued to work together in imaginative and creative ways. UNC's African American History Month lecture is one of the best examples of how our community chooses to acknowledge who we are and what we represent, while also reminding us of the challenges that remain. For several years, we at UNC, like those at many other institutions around the country, have engaged in an important process of self-examination and reassessment. We're in a historical moment of looking back to better understand our history and correct the record in places where the truth has not been told, or to amend the record in places where the truth was known but omitted. In particular, our campus struggles to reckon with the legacy of African American exclusion from and discrimination within UNC Chapel Hill. But this is also a place where African American lives and histories are constantly examined, re-examined, and also celebrated through critical scholarly work in numerous departments, centers and institutes, student groups, and alumni organizations. African American History Month offers an unusual opportunity for reflection and celebration, but our collective search for the most significant and revelatory aspects of Black life is ongoing. As a key element of both US and global history, African American history must be a year-round pursuit. Thank you all for joining us here this evening to share in this celebratory moment in a long and continuing quest to represent history in full. And so now I turn it over to Professor Slocum.
Thank you. I am so delighted, thrilled, and honored to be able to introduce Dr. Marcia Chatelain, who is Professor of History and African American Studies at Georgetown University, the author of Southside Girls, Growing Up in the Great Migration, published by Duke University Press in 2015. She teaches about women and girls' history, as well as Black capitalism. Her latest book, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America, published by Liveright Publishing and W.W. Norton in 2020 examines the intricate relationship among African-American politicians, civil rights organizations, communities, and the fast food industry. The book has been a force. It has been very well received and recognized, deservedly so. In 2021, Dr. Chatelain received the Pulitzer Prize in History, the Hagley Prize in Business History, and the Organization of American Historians Lawrence W. Levine Award for franchise. An active public speaker and educational consultant, Chatelain has received awards and honors from the Ford Foundation, the American Association of University Women, and the German Marshall Fund of the United States. At Georgetown, she has won several teaching awards. In 2016, the Chronicle of Higher Education named her a top influencer in academia in recognition of her social media campaign, #FergusonSyllabus, which implored educators to facilitate discussions about the crisis in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. She has held an Eric and Wendy Schmidt Fellowship at New America, a National Endowment for the Humanities Faculty Fellowship, and an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship. I'm so delighted that she is here. We're in for a treat. This is actually not the first time she's joined us. Some of the challenges that Dr. Lindsay mentioned the campus has gone through in the past, Dr. Chatelain was here previously to help us think through it. So we know that she is wonderful at what she does, and I'm really delighted to hear from her. Dr. Chatelain.
Thank you so much, everyone, for the warm welcome. And thank you, everyone, for hanging in on another Zoom to learn together and to spend time together. Today, I'm going to talk about my most recent book, Franchise, but I really hope this can be an opportunity for us to speak about my favorite topic, and that is how history can allow us to develop the problem-solving tools that we need for our day. I've had so many wonderful experiences facilitated by Professor Slocum at the Stone Center and on UNC's campus, looking at those questions that I think plague all thinking and creative and history-loving people, and that is how institutions understand and communicate about their pasts, how we develop the kind of learning that our students and communities need so that they can change the future, and what the role of the public university is in working towards the public good. At this time, I'm going to do like I've done over the past 2 years and share my screen and go through a presentation on my book, and then I hope we can really get into the heart of various questions. I've been extremely fortunate and honored that this book, Franchise, The Golden Arches in Black America, has received such positive recognition in terms of reviews, in terms of thoughtful questions, as well as major prizes. But one of the things I think is important to acknowledge is that this is not possible. The publication of this book, the research that went into it, the conversations that it engages in, without the serious commitment to African-American history and African-American studies that has been done at the institutional level over the past 5 decades. My strange book about Black people and McDonald's does not have any resonance without the incredible groundbreaking work of scholars in African-American studies who have been able to translate to broad audiences the importance of centering race as well as aligning the Black experience and understanding not only US history, but global history. It's also an incredible honor to see in the participants list of the webinar, so many scholars that I admire who have also been part of helping bring African-American studies and African-American history at the very center where it belongs for our understanding of contemporary social issues. And so back to my weird book about Black people and McDonald's, which started as a series of questions that started to come to mind as I engaged in various activities with the food justice movement when I was a graduate student at Brown University in the early 2000s. And one of the things that I often thought about as a child of the 80s and 90s was this guy going to McDonald's. For those of you who are not familiar, this is Bill Clinton. He was president of the United States when I was in junior high. And images like this of Bill Clinton jogging to McDonald's, sometimes with his vice president, Al Gore, were often part of the representation of America's first boomer president. In many ways, Bill Clinton brought the presidency into an era of a certain type of cool that had not been earlier represented because of his age, and partly because of his class background and his hailing from the South. Now, many of you may have heard that Toni Morrison called Bill Clinton the first Black president. But what you may not be aware of is the actual text that that idea comes from. And I'll share it with you briefly. So in October of 1998, Toni Morrison wrote an essay for the New Yorker, Talk of the Town section, in which she was talking about how she had turned off cable news because she was tired of seeing the Clinton impeachment trials. And she likened the way that Congress was pursuing Clinton to the ways that Black people are pursued in America's criminal justice system. And she wrote, after all, Clinton displays almost every trope of Blackness: single parent household, born poor, working class, saxophone playing, McDonald's and junk food loving boy from Arkansas. And in the conversations about Clinton's Blackness, I think it's interesting how this trope has kind of been repeated so many times, especially during the Obama years, but rarely have people put into context what Morrison was referring to. And for my interest, I thought it was really fascinating that McDonald's becomes one of the signifiers of Clinton's Blackness. And so in thinking about the relationship between Blackness and McDonald's, it made me think about how a cultural product like McDonald's, which is consumed in the United States and around the world, on one hand is accessible and enjoyed by all people, but in its own way can signify Blackness. And in thinking about that relationship, I started to pay very close attention to where I saw McDonald's represented. And during 2014, when I was engaging the conversation about the importance of teaching about Ferguson and the crisis in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014, I was struck by images of this McDonald's restaurant on Florissant Avenue in Ferguson, Missouri. And this McDonald's was the epicenter in many ways of the struggle, where people would gather, where a lot of the news stand-ups, you would see the McDonald's in the background. Here you see state troopers in confrontation with protesters at this McDonald's. And images like this made me think about images like this. This is Washington, D.C. in 1968, during the Holy Week uprisings, shortly after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination in Memphis, Tennessee. And the distance between Ferguson, Missouri in 2014 and Washington, D.C. in 1968 weren't as far as one would imagine when you think about how these moments opened up the door for an engagement of how the fast food industry interfaces with Black communities in struggle. During this time that I was starting to think about writing the book Franchise, I had initially thought that I would write a book about Black people and food and the civil rights movement. And what was coming together was a not really well-formed manuscript that should have just been a bunch of essays and articles. It's kind of like meetings that should have been an email, where I was putting together different ideas in which the civil rights movement was interacting with food justice. And I had thought about, in the 1980s, the presence of the National Black McDonald's Operators Association in major cities. And I was going to write a little bit about Black people in McDonald's. But after I was pushed by an editor who gave me some feedback on the manuscript, she said, I think McDonald's can be the whole story here. And that set me on a course of really thinking about the proximity of McDonald's and racial social unrest since 1968. And that's what really gave birth to the idea for Franchise. For all the graduate students in the audience, and for the emerging scholars and the aspiring writers, I highly recommend getting feedback on your ideas in the early stages, because getting that conversation together to really think about, could there be a story here? Could there be something of substance that is about McDonald's and Black America fundamentally changed my life as a scholar and writer. Growing up in Chicago, I was also very familiar with signs like this. This is a plaque outside of a McDonald's in Woodlawn, which is a neighborhood on the south side of Chicago, a few miles from the University of Chicago in Hyde Park. And in this sign, we see the commemoration of the first McDonald's franchise to an African-American owner operator. And I thought this was a really curious sign because you see that December 21st, 1968 is about 8.5 months after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. And this is not a coincidence. And so in thinking about why this plaque becomes a marker of Black progress and how close the first McDonald's operator is to King's assassination and the role of the Black franchise McDonald's in Ferguson, Missouri, I started to try to tell the story of America in the post-King years from the perspective of McDonald's. And what that lens and what that filter provided was an opportunity to think in a really interdisciplinary way, not only about civil rights history, but business history, the history of marketing, the history of the arts, as well as a history of how we have crafted in the United States a series of responses to racial unrest that fundamentally miss the point of why we have so much unfinished business in the United States. Writing this book and it coming out in early 2020 and then experiencing the George Floyd summer brought a layer of poignancy to some of those questions about whether or not we find ourselves in 20 or 50-year cycles of trying to answer the questions of what is missing in the discourse about racial inequality in America. So just a little primer for those of you out there about franchising. There are about 250,000 fast food restaurants in the United States, and there are about 760,000 businesses that are franchises. If you've ever been to a Hilton hotel, if you've ever gone to a FedEx Kinko's, if you've ever dropped your kids off at a Bright Start daycare, if you've ever gone to a Dunkin' Donuts in an airport, or gotten your hair cut at a Sports Clips or one of those kind of mall storefront hair places, you have probably engaged in business with a franchise. And while we often associate franchising with fast food, the idea of the franchise is that the corporate parent does all of the thinking for you and makes a lot of the decisions for you, and then you do the work. And I think that there's something fundamentally tied to the American dream, that you can become rich if you just follow the rules, that has captured the attention of Americans towards franchising. And we can talk a little bit more about that later. So what was most interesting to me in telling the story of McDonald's, its origin stories, was to think about the ways that the fast food industry was predicated on the same institutions that excluded Black people from the promises of post-World War II financial as well as social mobility. You know, one of the things that I thought was really fascinating was I read a lot of books about McDonald's. There are a lot of business histories, a lot of analysis and critiques, some great sociology about working in fast food that rarely engages the ways that the historical roots of the fast food industry are aligned with the very practices that excluded African Americans from, again, the largesse of the American economy. If we think about the building of highways, if we think about the tensions that existed for Black travelers around being able to access rest stops and gas stations and roadside restaurants and hotels, if we think about the emergence of McDonald's as serving the ascendant white middle class in white flight suburbs, and we think about the fact that many of the first white men who entered fast food franchising were able to use loans from banks as well as provisions from the GI Bill for this small business ownership, we see all of these structural barriers that were erected around Black people from accessing capital. But we also see a kind of fantasy of a raceless possibility of economic prosperity that is just about hard work and that is just about innovation and good ideas. The McDonald's brothers, Richard and Maurice, in building the McDonald's restaurant in San Bernardino and then opening a few in Southern California and Arizona, they brought a kind of Fordist sensibility to the production of food. So they streamlined their menu. Here on the slide, you see the original menu, which is like a mess. There's peanut butter sandwiches, there's barbecue, there's all sorts of stuff. But what they learned is that they could really feed the bottom line if they did burgers, French fries, and beverages. And so in mechanizing food production and being able to feed a lot of people very quickly, they brought the kind of manufacturing process inside a fast food restaurant, and they were able to sell their product for a very low price. And so car culture, highway culture, fast food culture was all about an idea of American prosperity that at its core was about protecting the value of whiteness. And so in reframing the story of McDonald's and putting the issue of race at the center, I was able to draw upon the excellent scholarship of scholars of housing and race and mid-century America into a story that I think has been wildly protected from the realities of racial discrimination, as well as racial violence. One of the most satisfying discoveries in the research process was to find out that McDonald's was the target of the kind of large-scale sit-in protests that we associate with Woolworth or Katz's Drugs, that in the state of North Carolina, after the student movement was ignited on February 1st, 1960 in Greensboro, with students at North Carolina A&T, it spread to Durham and it spread to Raleigh and it spread toward McDonald's. And in the South, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the NAACP were fighting against the segregated practices at McDonald's, you know, from Pine Bluff, Arkansas to Memphis and throughout North Carolina. And I think that this is so fundamentally important for McDonald's to be in that story of civil rights, of that bygone era, because they are one of the few restaurants that still remains as an active, viable business that is tied to this period of racial discrimination, as well as direct action protest against those practices. And so in thinking about the civil rights question, I move into the days after King's assassination to look at a series of initiatives on the part of McDonald's to recruit their first Black franchise owner. Now, there have been discussions about bringing an African-American into franchise ownership that was quickened by King's assassination. And one of the things that, if you look at the Great Riot Commission reports, starting with, you know, the summer of 1919 up into the Ferguson report from 2014, you see some common threads. And one of those threads is that people in communities that erupted in racial violence and confrontation, often because of an instance of police brutality, or in the case of King, this, you know, very high profile assassination, people talk about the problems of business. And they often talk about it in terms of paying higher prices for low quality service or goods. But one of the things that I think is also important is that in these reports, and again, going all the way to 1919, people talk about the issue of housing, they talk about police brutality, they talk about the lack of quality schools for their kids, they talk about joblessness, they talk about the consequences of racial capitalism very clearly. But it seems like there is an impulse, and I think it happens today, that the response is to say, okay, people are asking for business ownership. And so the impulse to respond to racial unrest with business opportunity is one that has been with us for many, many years. And so after King's assassination, the hunt for the next Black, or for the first rather Black franchise owner was well on its way. And it went to this man who is in the center of this photograph, Herman Petty, who opens the first Black McDonald's on Chicago's South Side. And newspapers like the Chicago Defender and Black Enterprise, which is founded in 1970, often feature Black franchise owners, and they talk about them as members of the community, as models of Black success in the same ways that an earlier generation would have talked about Black funeral home directors or Black bankers, other people who had been kind of unelected officials and ambassadors to the Black community and who were able to broker levels of negotiation and power with white power structures. And so in many ways, I think the Black franchisee takes on that role in the late 1960s, and they're celebrated as not only breaking barriers in corporate America, but playing a role in the community, because ultimately the idea was the franchise would be the lever of opportunity in places that had been left behind by deindustrialization, by the war on poverty and its turn away towards the urban core, as well as a way of trying to prevent another instance of racial unrest. And so in many ways, the franchise is tasked with doing quite a bit. And in many ways that we hear today in the post-George Floyd era, in which support Black business becomes a response to what happened in Minneapolis and throughout the country, there was a similar impulse in the 1960s that these Black businesses would be able to transform the communities in which they were opened. And so throughout the book, I look at the political economy of McDonald's in Black America. And an incident in Cleveland in the early 1970s, I think, really highlights that. This is a picture of Louis Stokes, Carl Stokes. Louis was his brother, who was a congressman. Carl Stokes was the first Black mayor of Cleveland. He's considered the first Black mayor of a major city. And he is the first Black mayor elected in a city that has a slight majority of white voters. And Carl Stokes was on his way to re-election until a group called Operation Black Unity mounted a boycott of McDonald's on the predominantly east side of Cleveland. And this boycott was unlike the boycotts of the 1960s that were about access to service. These boycotts were about access to the franchise. And the argument was that if there was a McDonald's in a Black community, it should be Black owned, and that the profits should be used for reinvestment in community projects like parks and a swimming pool, and that the community should ultimately have a say on how this business appears relative to its Black neighbors. And I think that this moment is pivotal, not only because I think it is an extension of the move towards self-determination and nation building, while also participating in civic processes that were facilitated by war on poverty funds, as well as the rise of Black political candidates on the local level. But it's about this fundamental question about who makes money from whom and in what ways. And this conflict in Cleveland, it gets very dramatic. There are unsolved homicides, there's connections to Jonestown, there's a kind of a looming sense that there may be some fraud. But at the heart of it is this issue that McDonald's is not yet a known quantity to African-American communities, and it has to negotiate the expectations, whether or not it's Black owned or white owned, that there is a way that McDonald's presence is supposed to mean something in these communities that McDonald's is slowly realizing are incredibly profitable, because there has been a flight of not just white people as residents of these communities, but also of white businesses. And so in this gap comes McDonald's, in this space where there has been so much flight, and there are these questions about what the community can demand. One of the other elements of thinking about the rise of McDonald's in Black communities is that this is a period of time as McDonald's is kind of inching over, that 1 billion mark of serving hamburgers, that there's community resistance against McDonald's. And I think that in this era in which we are confounded about what can we do about corporations and how do we push back against them, these are these moments where there is real hope and potential for locally based community groups to push back against this new presence that is emerging. And so in Portland, Oregon, there is a conflict between McDonald's and the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And there was an allegation that the Black Panther Party in that area has bombed a local McDonald's because they refuse to participate in the free breakfast program for children. There are a lot of reasons to believe that this is not entirely true, as there is incredible pressure and surveillance on this local party chapter. This photograph that you see is a picture from surveillance outside of that McDonald's that was the target of this alleged bombing. But the questions that the party is asking about how McDonald's is going to interface with its community programs opens up a series of questions again about what does it mean for McDonald's to be in a Black community, and is McDonald's a legitimate extension of the idea of a Black-owned business? And so you see these local level conflicts in Portland. In the Ogons neighborhood of Philadelphia, there's an anti-McDonald's campaign based on the argument that local people should have the say on what kind of businesses come into their communities. There's also an attempt on the part of Black celebrities to cash in on the popularity of fast food as well as franchising in Black communities by creating competing brands that make the argument that if you really want to buy Black, if you really want to support your community, these are the franchises you should invest in. And so folks like Muhammad Ali create Champ Burger. Mahalia Jackson creates a line of fried chicken restaurants called Glory Fried Chicken that actually look like churches. They're built by the McKissick architectural firm, and they have, kind of like the flying buttress and the vestibule. And all of these attempts to kind of cash in on the frenzy around franchising is tied to this idea that you don't just franchise a McDonald's, that Black community centers could, that radical groups could do it, churches, and that you could reinvest in your community. And this really does show the ways that the idea of Black financial empowerment and the seductiveness of Black capitalism as a response to the failures of the implementation of the legislative and policy victories of the 50s and 60s is something that I came to a greater understanding and appreciation of throughout the writing of this book, that we may say it is cynical, but I think that the exhaustion and the disappointment of seeing these incredible victories really fail to transform the quality of Black lives led people to this idea that if there was enough economic power in Black communities, they could insulate themselves from the worst of racial injustice, or at best make a stronger case for themselves based on the wealth within communities. I kind of get it. And I think that this history and this period of time really coheres nicely with the excellent work by people like Devin Fergus about Soul City, North Carolina, and his study of Black power and liberalism. Thomas Healy has a recent book about Soul City. And this is this period of experimentation that, I always warn my students against, making fun of people who had these ideas that we know today, we know with the vantage of, historical hindsight, that why they weren't going to work, but the possibilities and the experimentation are something that I try to be not only respectful of, but understanding of why there was such a hope in these possibilities. And so I couldn't write a book about McDonald's without talking about the cultural work of McDonald's. As a child, again, of the 80s and 90s, I kind of grew up with McDonald's interventions to Black communities in the forms of advertising featuring Black families, the sponsorship of the Martin Luther King Jr. holiday. The first time I really saw content about Martin Luther King Jr., it was a mini documentary that had been created by McDonald's for the MLK holiday in 86 and 87 that featured interviews with, MLK's assistant, and it had a little song. You may remember it, but these types of cultural interventions in Black America, I think, are really, really important to acknowledge. So much of the critiques of fast food and so much of the analysis of food and race really focus on what people consume in terms of food. But I think that there is really rarely an accounting for the cultural work and the effective cultural work that corporations, particularly fast food corporations, do in ingratiating themselves to Black experiences and Black cultural forms that not only show up in the form of things like sponsoring a gospel tour, but the integration of gospel music, of hip hop, of rap, of R&B in the commercial content, and the creation of youth programming around Double Dutch and the All-American Basketball League are also part of this process. Because what essentially happens after '68, with the introduction of Black franchise owners into the system, and the focus on Black advertising and marketing, McDonald's writes itself into a narrative of civil rights in which they claim that they open up franchising to African Americans in response to the kind of moral and social imperatives of King's assassination. What they don't quite explain is the fact that many white franchise owners did not want to do business in predominantly Black areas, and that there is also a movement of some of these franchise owners out of the cities and into the suburbs. And so you start to see, a lot of these patterns of a kind of racial realignment of where power and opportunity can emerge as a result of these crises. And the last bit of the book looks at a more contemporary period. Chapter 6 looks at a series of conflicts between McDonald's franchise owners and the corporation around allegations of redlining. And this part of the story was really fascinating to me because so many of the experiences of Black franchise owners mirror the ways that African Americans talk about trying to move into racially segregated areas. And so a lot of my examination of this period looks at a conflict in the early 1980s where a Black franchise owner claims that he is being redlined out of the suburbs in Southern California. McDonald's says, don't you want to do business in your community? I thought this was the point. And it really starts to show the emergence of corporate social responsibility talk around race, as well as the intervention of the NAACP in a series of agreements with corporations that are supposed to expand opportunity in an era where affirmative action has been, chipped away at with the Bakke decision by the Supreme Court, but there is still a space in which people like Jesse Jackson, who's pictured here, look behind him and you see Reverend Al Sharpton, as representatives of Operation Push and the National Action Network, respectively, are doing the brokering and they are doing the negotiation on behalf of groups like the Black McDonald's Operators Association to say, you've got a race problem, let's expand the number of Black-owned restaurants. Well, in this process, this leads to more McDonald's restaurants, and then similar agreements are made with Burger King and KFC. It brings more fast foods into these communities that are already, one would argue, saturated with this type of business. And in concluding the book, I think about another moment in which McDonald's intersects in this question of race and urban uprising. And this comes from Los Angeles in 1992, after the acquittal of 4 police officers in the beating of Rodney King, which was one of the first times video footage of police brutality was circulated widely on the news. This is the pre-social media era, but the videotape became available to a lot of viewers. And the acquittal led to a week of unrest in Los Angeles. And at the conclusion of that week, the CEO of McDonald's at the time, Ed Renzi, issued a statement saying that the restaurants in South Los Angeles, which was the epicenter of the unrest, were unharmed because of McDonald's socially progressive commitments made a quarter of a century earlier after 1968. And this is one of the early kind of ripples about this story that made me incredibly curious about this claim and how to validate it. But what does it mean that it's repeated and circulated not only among communities of Black franchise owners, but you see it in business books about corporate ethics and corporate social responsibility. The idea that McDonald's had insulated itself from the ire and the rage and the irritation of of Black people, because of the way it showed up in Black communities, was an incredibly provocative idea that I think needed exploring. And so, at the end of the day, what I hope this book has been able to do is really highlight an incredible, the incredible place of African-American history and African-American studies in telling deeper and nuanced stories about contemporary social problems. That when we talk about fast food and race, that we are often fixated on these questions about health and nutrition and marketing to children, which are important questions that I know many of your colleagues in the School of Public Health are tackling, as well as the former First Lady and things like the Let's Move initiative. And I also know that historians and advocates for labor are thinking about the story in terms of the impact on workers. And we know during COVID-19, the ways that the Fight for 15 have been able to articulate the incredible precarity and danger of fast food work, and that we know these things. But I think that it's important for us to also acknowledge the role of history, the complicated ways that consumer citizenship, Black capitalism, as well as the deep desire for inclusion into something for good and for bad, has also animated not only consumer choices and consuming McDonald's, but thinking about where McDonald's fits within a landscape of a federal government that has yet to fully account not only for the incredible damages wrought by slavery, let alone repair the breaches of the contemporary period, how the corporation still appears as a beacon of hope in light of all that we know of the unfinished business of racial reconciliation. And so with that, that concludes my formal presentation, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
If you stop your share, thank you. So for our guests that are with us that would like to ask questions, we're asking that you place your questions either in the Q&A or down in the chat, and we will relay them. I would like to take a point of privilege here and maybe ask the first question, and to get a sense of what you think is the reason. You spoke of a number of other attempts to develop, and I remember Chatburg, it was terrible, but this was Joe Frazier. Why is it that McDonald's has been able to persist where many of these other franchises, some who started out by targeting or at least placing themselves squarely in Black communities, were not able to make it?
Well, there's two things that happened. And, this was probably one of the most fun parts of the research, because every famous Black person tried this. James Brown gets involved in this, Sammy Davis Jr. I mean, we think about these legends of Black entertainment, and they are trying to do burgers and biscuits and all sorts of things. First of all, a lot of these businesses were not Black owned. It was leasing the name, image, and likeness to these companies that were actually white owned, but had a very keen understanding of the importance of Black empowerment and Black economic empowerment as, an entry place in the market. But, when we think about capital, you can't beat McDonald's. Even when McDonald's takes a hit, you can't beat McDonald's. One, because McDonald's is an incredible property owner in the United States. If you've seen the movie with Michael Keaton, the founder, they show Ray Kroc on a plane, and he goes up and he's looking at all this property, and his associate says, you should buy the land. McDonald's is an incredible property owner in the United States. So the real estate holdings alone will always ensure that it has the capital, but it also had a winning system. It was able to control the supply chain and supply prices. So, it's a David and Goliath story, even within, 13 years of it becoming a major franchise. Black-owned businesses with the money from, Ford Foundation, the Office of minority business enterprise in the Nixon administration could never compete with what McDonald's had available to it.
Okay, so it wasn't the food.
I mean, the food was not good either. I heard all sorts of bad reviews of some of the food, and it did not have the soul as promised.
Right, right. Well, there's another thing that I think you may want to make clear for us then. When you talk about buying the land and buying the property, so the franchisees are they renting from McDonald's?
So yeah, they have rental agreements, and within the franchise system, let's say you want a Krispy Kreme or a Chick-fil-A, maybe not Chick-fil-A, but like a Krispy Kreme or a Subway. There's a negotiation of rent, and so if the landlord wants you out, you've got to renegotiate. McDonald's has their own real estate holding company, and so they don't have to negotiate with themselves for rents and to be able to establish stores. And that is a large part of their success.
Okay, we have a question from Ted. Do you want to ask your question? I'm trying to let you in. Ted Johnson. Okay, so he's lowered his hand, so I guess he decided he didn't want to ask that question. Okay. All right, so let's go ahead, let's go forward. And so as you got into this, you said, and I must say to folks, we were very much looking forward to having Dr. Chatelain here on campus so that she would be able to sign books and do all of those kinds of things, and folks would have been able to read them before she came in, but we weren't able to do it. So the question that kind of comes to mind that you sort of teased was the challenges now that people, and you've kind of cautioned us how we look at it. How do we now try to deal with the fact that it's not so much a question of economics and opportunity and whatever, but a question of Black folks' health and the health of other people of color and people who, for class reasons, may end up dealing with McDonald's on a daily basis for every meal?
Well, I think that those things are tied in the sense that, the levers that are pushing where businesses are open and operating, we have become more aware, I think, over the past 10 to 15 years about the problem of access to fresh food and grocery stores with affordable, foods for people. But one of the things that I caution our analysis is that we say, yes, we don't want people to have diets that are heavy in fast food because it can have health consequences. But I think we have to take a step back and say, well, what is the landscape in which people are able to make choices? And, sometimes people think that the policy intervention is either to ban fast food or to bring a grocery store in. And I say, okay, but before we do that, what are people's working lives, right? Fast food is a practical good choice if you work in 2 jobs and you need carbs, fat, sugar real fast so you can go to your next job and you can have the energy to work that job. It has long-term consequences, but sometimes it's not the worst idea. And so we need to look at not just the availability of food, but the food ecosystem. Do people have access to healthcare? Do we have consistent housing? Can you pay your gas and electric bill so you can refrigerate and cook that food that's fresh and better for you? So I think that we have to start thinking about the ways that inequality and poverty exacerbate quality of life issues, that once we address those, then we can trust people to live in an environment where they can make, they can make choices because they actually have those choices available to them.
All right, we have 3 questions that just came in. One from Joanne Johnson. How has your own relationship with McDonald's changed since delving into your research? They're trying to see if McDonald's is paying you now. That's just probably what it is.
Yeah, no, McDonald's aren't the best of friends these days.
Yeah.
Listen, I'm not, I'm not here to mess up anyone's bag, as the young people say. The Black franchise community, I think, represents the real perils of what an opportunity means, right? And I understand that as a philanthropic community, they've had incredible impact on Black institutions, and a lot of them see their work as part of an extension of trying to uplift their people. And at the same time, the terms and the conditions that make that one of the few routes to do that is where I have a real issue. I grew up eating McDonald's. I'm a child of the 80s. It wasn't a big deal that your kids ate at McDonald's. No one looked down on you for doing that during the time that I grew up. I had a lot of fun at McDonald's, a lot of teenage independence there. But what I grew to an understanding of as a historian was, how did McDonald's have such an outsized impact in one community? How is it that in the lives of Black people, McDonald's has so much significance? And that is what always concerns me. And the other thing, though, I will say, I started to really appreciate the creativity that comes out of the fast food industry through this research process. The toys and the characters and the commercials. And, I realized that, some of my favorite actors and actresses and singers growing up, they did McDonald's commercials very early. It becomes this incredible outlet for Black creativity that, again, I wish we had public funded arts programs so that people could, do their craft in the theater, and they don't have to get their first opportunity, playing in a McDonald's commercial. But that's the world we live in. So, and the last thing I will say about workers is that I came to a deeper appreciation of the hard work of working in fast food. It's incredible to think about that level of meal preparation for that many people in such a short period of time.
Speaking of work, we have a question from Professor Sturkey. How has McDonald's reacted to issues such as Black Lives Matter and Fight for 15?
Great question from one of my favorite historians, Professor Sturkey. It's kind of interesting. So, after the George Floyd summer in 2020, McDonald's created this Twitter video where they said, Black Lives Matter. And they talked about how they were going to donate money to the Urban League and the NAACP. And, corporations like that don't make these choices unless they feel like it could be net positive. It may alienate some, but they kind of know their base. I think it kind of fits within the standard, corporate, empty, Black Lives Matter to us kind of script that we saw a lot of in 2020. Fight for 15, while it hasn't been able to fundamentally change the federal minimum wage, Fight for 15 has been effective in some localities, like in Washington, D.C., I believe in Tacoma, Washington, and other places, to raise the minimum wage, which does have an impact on McDonald's. I think that they are not afraid that they're going to lose federal support for keeping the minimum wage so low. But what Fight for 15 does is make patronizing McDonald's a moral issue that I think, because we are now in a landscape of fast casual and prepared foods in grocery stores, there's more food available fast that's more delicious, some could argue, or more interesting, that it does kind of chip away, that I think, from its ability to reach consumers at a certain kind of class level and consumers at a kind of social level. The one thing I will say that happened after the emergence of COVID is that McDonald's said that they were providing paid sick leave in its stores. But if you read the fine print, that's for company-owned stores, which represent, fewer than 10% of all its restaurants. So it kind of understands the questions that consumers are raising about it, and it's trying to navigate to suggest that, it can be on the right side of history.
Okay. You have another question from Dr. Gers Escandon. We heard a lot about men in this history. What has been the record and relationship of the franchise with African-American and all women as owners, executive managers, and employees?
That's a great question. As someone who was trained in, women's history and whose first book was about women and girls, I was a little unsettled by the fact that I wrote about so few women in this story because, the franchise core was male dominated. Eventually Black women enter the system. The early Black franchise owners come in sometimes as spouses who inherit the business. One of the things that's interesting is I met some Black women who were franchise owners, and some wanted me to know that they did not marry into McDonald's, that they did it themselves. And it was this really important point of distinction. The programs that kind of opened the door for Black men in the 70s, they're replicated for women. And I think in many ways, as we see with a lot of affirmative action programs, a lot of white women benefit from that assistance. The other thing that is kind of interesting is I did talk to a few Black women who were managers who said that, in those early days, it was really the Black owned McDonald's that would give women a chance for moving up the ranks, that there was, definitely both a race and gender barrier for Black women to enter management. And this was kind of before the feminization of the service industry that we see today. And now that wouldn't be unusual to see a Black woman as a McDonald's manager.
Are there any statistics on that?
I don't have good numbers on that, but there's still, a gap,
Okay.
a racial and gender gap.
Okay. There's a question, this is a 3-part, I'm going to give you one part of it. And this is someone who's asking, can you say something about McDonald's ownership and the implications for generational wealth?
This is a big, big issue. So you may be aware that recently there was a lawsuit filed by more than 50 Black franchise owners. And then there was a big lawsuit by Herb Washington, former athlete who was a McDonald's franchise owner, about some issues in terms of McDonald's being able to provide relief to its franchise owners and their ability to expand. And one of the things that is the concern of some franchise owners is the ability to pass on the business or to sell the business and create wealth for their families. Depending on a number of factors, some people say that this definitely is possible. Sometimes there's a concern among Black franchise owners that their children don't want in on the business. And I think that this is an interesting kind of generational situation where you have one generation of Black franchisee who kind of struggled, maybe got their foot in the door in corporate America, leveraged their assets to get into franchising, and their children have now been educated at elite schools like your UNCs, your UVAs, and they come out of college and the idea of working at a McDonald's and franchising McDonald's is not attractive to them. So there have been initiatives within the Black franchise community to try to develop what they call next gen. And this is, family businesses are contentious, but there are some families that have taken great pride in now entering the stage of a third generation of ownership.
Okay. I'm going to take a stab at this question because I don't understand it fully. Gary is asking, because McDonald's is one of the oldest franchises in the US, do you believe that the business climate today is more conducive for more recently established franchises to be socially responsible with respect to race? Or perhaps is McDonald's just an early exception?
I think I know what you're getting at. I think that the business landscape and the demands are different. I think in the period in which McDonald's was recruiting Black franchise owners, I think that, their interpretation was they were trying to expand opportunity because the moment called for it, but they were also taking advantage of the Nixon administration's shift towards Black capitalism, which put federal funds into Black ownership and entrepreneurship. It expanded some of the programs in the Small Business Administration. And you also had, groups like the Ford Foundation that were also invested in this. So there was there was financial kind of assistance to see what was possible. And there was also, an immediate response by Black consumers for McDonald's. People went and they spent their money and they saw it was good business. I think today, businesses on the whole understand the kind of expectation within the diversity, equity, inclusion speak, whether or not they fully commit and whether or not they embrace these values is uncertain. But I think that there is an understanding that that framework, if they don't make a statement about that framework, that there will be an expectation or there will be an issue that they have to kind of resolve. And there's just a lot more expertise in that area. There's a whole corporate mechanism available to people today to kind of enter that territory. In those early days, alumni of the civil rights movement were consulting with McDonald's. C.T. Vivian is talking to McDonald's about Black people. People like Hank Thomas, who was a freedom writer, very important in North Carolina. He is, in McDonald's franchising. Julian Bond was a big advocate of franchising. And so, they had a cadre of civil rights folks to turn to for advice during that time.
Okay. We have another question from Vice Provost Westbrooks. What percentage of current franchises are owned by Blacks and Latinas?
So I just, I'm working on a piece about the issue of the Hispanic Operators Association. Their numbers are maybe, 11% of franchisees. I think Black ownership is about 11% as well. There's the issues about whether or not the franchisee community is representative of the American population has been one of the issues in the recent settlement between McDonald's and Black franchise owners who have been concerned about racial discrimination within the system. But part of the issue is not just the franchise ownership on their from their position. It's about the ability to amass more than one or two restaurants. The more restaurants you have in your portfolio, the better you do. And so, people are trying to get to 8 or 9 restaurants in their portfolio, and then you're really cooking there. Sorry, that was a bad pun.
Okay, just a couple more then. There's a question about the comment you made about the interaction with your editor. And this person is really asking, please say more about the benefit of getting early feedback. How do you get past stress or concern about your creativity being challenged or your scholarship being scrutinized?
I mean, it's part of the business. It's hard. I think that as a scholar, you kind of grow in your trusting your gut. When someone gives you advice that doesn't kind of sit right with your values or your ideas of how you want to develop your voice, that's important. But, academic in the before times when we met in person, I would really relish the time at academic conferences to have appointments with editors from presses that I didn't think I would necessarily work with. And I would say that, the great people at the University of North Carolina Press were really helpful in giving me early feedback on franchise as well. Mark Simpson and Voss and, Joe Parsons and all sorts of people, it's just talking through your ideas. Every reader is different, and, publishing doesn't always, know what's right, but, sometimes you'll find a trend in what people really focus on. And I was presenting a lot of ideas and people would say, like, tell me about the McDonald's thing again. Can we talk about McDonald's again? Because McDonald's is such a good entry point into a lot of conversations, because rarely do I go to one of these events and someone has never eaten at a McDonald's. Twice that has happened to me, where 2 people said, I've never eaten at McDonald's. One was a vegan from childhood, and the other was the child of a nutritionist. Other than that, everyone has a sense of what they want on the menu, what they think of the menu, and being able to have a common table to set for readers, I think is so important as a writer and as a historian.
We have this last question is actually from the same person. They want to know what would be the best publishers for an amateur author. So this person not only likes your book, they want to find a way to do something similar.
I think the best platforms to start are writing groups where people can give you honest feedback. People who you think are smart, who are specialists and non-specialists. Start pitching locally and kind of build a platform there. Heaven help us because of our recent political climate. But I just think Twitter is good for your writing. I think the ability to be concise and to engage ideas is sometimes the best starting place to kind of work on inviting people into your ideas. And there's so many web platforms. There's Substack. There's blogs, places in which you can start to have conversations. But the key to writing, and I think being an author, the best thing that I do for my writing is I read a lot of people I respect and admire. And when you read good writing, you force yourself to try to match the things that you're engaging with.
Right. Can you tell us what you're working on now?
I've got some things cooking. I can't quite talk about them now, but I want to continue taking up these questions that started in franchise about what happens to Black politics in the 1970s. I think that we are at such a great moment where people are taking the 1970s seriously, that it's not just a punchline era. It isn't a point where people lost hope. It was this period of great experimentation and creativity, and the possibility of Black liberation felt like right in front of everyone. And so some more work about how we understand King's legacy in unconventional ways. This book is about King's legacy, and it's also about McDonald's.
Well, thank you. I can tell you had fun writing this. It's very, very interesting. I think that when folks think about this as a subject, they don't think that much about how much it's tied to some of the political history, particularly the history around Black rights, access to so-called American dream, ownership, and all of those kinds of elements. So we're very, very happy to have had you, and happy that you agreed to be here with us. I could tell in a lot of ways that you were doing so many things. So taking this time out to join us has really been a treat. We also want to thank all of our guests who joined us to listen in and to submit questions. Thanks once again to the History Department and to the other units that help to support this lecture. We look forward to your being back here with us again. We'll figure out some kind of way, I guess the next time Dr. Slocum is able to organize a Black Communities Conference, that we'll have more conversation about the role that McDonald's has played. So for all of us here, thank you once again. Thanks to all. We're going to check out now. If you would like to write anything else to our guest, please send it to the Stone Center, and we'll be certain to pass it on. There's Dr. Lindsay, who's back with us again. Thank you as well. Thank you, Carla, and good evening and good night to all.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.